A baby is born on the cold Mongolian steppe, holding a lump of clotted blood in his tiny fist. The old women who see it go silent, because on the steppe, that is not a good sign. Or maybe it is the best sign anyone has ever seen: nobody in. That tent has any idea that this baby will grow up to burn cities to the ground, rewrite the map of the entire planet, and build an empire so large that a man could ride for 100 days in a straight line and still not reach the other end. Of it, no permanent walls, no salaries, no roads, just a boy, a freezing wind, and a fist full of blood. This is the story of that baby, a boy who was abandoned to starve in the open grass with absolutely nothing, and who became Genghis Khan. This is the entire history of the Mongol Empire. Before we go any further, picture the world these people actually lived in. No cities, no walls, no kings sitting comfortably on stone thrones, just open grassland rolling out in every direction as far as a horse could run. Brutal winters that could kill an entire family in a single bad week, and clans of horsemen who would slaughter each other without a second thought over a good river, a fat herd of sheep, or a patch of grazing land that hadn't been claimed yet. There was no police force, no court system, no written law, only the law of whoever showed up strongest that particular week. A family without a protector simply did not survive out here. That was the reality Temujin was born into, and it shaped absolutely everything that came afterward. His father was a small-time clan leader named Yesugei, and Temujin was named after an enemy chief his father had just defeated in battle, a name meant to carry the taste of victory into the boy's very identity. But that early promise did not last long at all. When Temujin was around 9 years old, his father sat down to share a meal with some men from a rival clan called the Tatars, a meal that was supposed to be a gesture of peace along the road. Instead, they poisoned him. Yesugei died before he ever made it home, and the moment word got out, Temujin's own clan decided the family was no longer worth the trouble of protecting. A widow and a handful of young children were not going to help anyone win the next fight over grazing land or livestock, so they left them out in the open, on the bare grassland with no horses, no herd, and no food, and simply walked away, expecting the cold and the hunger to finish the job quietly within a single season. But Temujin's mother refused to let that happen. She kept her children alive through sheer stubbornness, digging up wild roots from underneath the frozen soil, catching fish with makeshift tools carved from bone and wood, and hunting down whatever small animals wandered close enough to be caught. It was during this desperate stretch that something happened that historians still argue about even today. Temujin got into a violent fight with his older half-brother over a stolen fish and a small bird the family had managed to catch, a fight so serious that it ended with Temujin killing him. It sounds shocking, and it was, but it also tells you everything about the world he was growing up in. Resources were that scarce, and control over even the smallest scraps of food mattered that much. There was no room left for sentiment when starvation was the alternative. Not long after that, rivals caught up with him again. This time, enemy warriors captured Temujin himself and forced a heavy wooden collar around his neck, dragging him from camp to camp as a prisoner and a walking symbol of his family's humiliation. He was starved, beaten, and came dangerously close to being executed on more than one occasion, until one night, under cover of darkness, he finally managed to slip away. He hid submerged in a nearby river, with only his nose above the waterline staying perfectly still for hours while his hunters searched the banks, waiting them out until nightfall let him disappear completely. A herder named Sorkin Shira, a man who had quietly shown him small kindnesses even while he was a prisoner, later helped conceal him and provided him with a horse, a bow, and a small amount of food. It was the very first time in Temujin's entire life that anyone had helped him simply because they wanted to, not because blood ties or old custom demanded it. That single lesson never left him for the rest of his life. He had watched his own clan abandon his mother and siblings the instant it became convenient to do so. So he grew up believing with total certainty that loyalty earned through respect and shared success was worth infinitely more than loyalty based purely on bloodline or birth order. That one idea, that ability and earned trust should matter more than ancestry, would eventually become the operating system of the largest land empire in human history. As a young man, Temujin built a crucial alliance with a powerful regional leader named Togrul, who had once been close with his late father. This relationship gave him protection and legitimacy during his most fragile and vulnerable years, even though the two men would eventually turn on each other once Temujin grew too strong to remain anyone's junior partner. His marriage to a woman named Borte also came with a heavy dose of steppe-level violence attached from the very beginning. She was kidnapped by a rival raiding party not long after their wedding, and rescuing her became a deeply personal mission that also happened to be Temujin's first real experience, commanding allied forces gathered from several different clans. In one coordinated operation, he got her back eventually, but their first son was born soon afterward. And the question of who the boy's real father actually was quietly haunted the family for the rest of both their lives, over the following 2 decades, through a brutal mix of patient alliances, painful betrayals, and the outright destruction of every rival power on the steppe: the Tatars who had murdered his father, the raiders who had once kidnapped his wife, and the powerful confederations who refused to bow to him no matter what. Temujin accomplished something nobody on the steppe had managed to pull off in centuries. He unified every scattered tribe, clan, and confederation under a single banner, ending generations of endless internal warfare. In the year 1206, at a great gathering of chiefs known as a Kuriltai, held out on the open grassland, he was formally declared universal ruler. Genghis Khan, the boy who had once been left in the grass to starve, now commanded every horse, every warrior, and every clan across the entire Mongolian plateau, and his very first move as supreme ruler was radical for the time. He tore apart the old clan system completely, the very structure that had once abandoned his family in their darkest hour, and reorganized his entire army around units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 men. Loyalty now flowed directly to the unit, to the commander, and ultimately to the Khan himself, not to some hereditary clan elder who simply happened to be born into the right family line. Discipline inside this new system was absolute and unforgiving. If a single soldier ran from a fight, the other 9 men in his unit were executed without exception, no matter how bravely any of them had personally fought that day, which meant nobody dared to run, because cowardice was no longer just a personal risk, it was a risk shared by everyone standing beside you. But here is the surprising part. Alongside all of that brutal military discipline, Genghis Khan also introduced a written code of law known as the Yasa. It banned the kidnapping of women, made livestock theft punishable by death, and guaranteed religious freedom to absolutely everyone living under Mongol rule, regardless of which god they happened to pray to. The very same man who was burning cities to rubble was simultaneously building one of the more progressive legal systems found anywhere on the planet at that point in history. He also had his people adopt a proper writing system for the Mongol language for the very first time, insisted that his sons and grandsons learn to read, and pulled in literate officials from conquered lands, Chinese, Persian, and others, to help him run an empire that was quickly growing too large and too complicated to manage from memory. Alone, talented commoners could rise to command 10,000 men if they proved themselves capable and loyal in battle. A level of social mobility that almost nobody else anywhere in the 13th century world was offering to ordinary people. With the steppe finally united and resources running dangerously thin, Genghis Khan turned his newly reorganized army toward northern China and the powerful Yuan Dynasty, a state with a population numbering in the tens of millions. Dwarfing the Mongols by every possible measure, the Mongols were unmatched fighters out in open country, but they had never once broken into a heavily fortified walled city before, and that gap in their knowledge was a serious problem. So, they adapted quickly and ruthlessly. They captured skilled Chinese engineers and forced them, under threat of death, to teach the secrets of siege warfare, catapults, battering rams, and complex methods of surrounding and starving out a fortified city. Their battlefield tactics turned genuinely horrifying from this point forward. Captured, civilians were sometimes pushed forward directly in front of advancing Mongol soldiers to serve as human shields. absorbing arrows meant for the army behind them. And in 1215, the Jin capital, standing on the very ground where modern Beijing sits today, finally fell after a long and agonizing siege. The city was thoroughly sacked and burned, and hundreds of thousands of its residents were killed in the aftermath. But even in the middle of all that destruction, the Mongols were surprisingly selective. Skilled engineers, craftsmen, and administrators were often deliberately spared because Genghis Khan understood something that a lot of conquerors throughout history never managed to figure out. You can smash a city into rubble, but you still need someone left alive who actually knows how to run it afterward. Next came a war that nobody actually had to fight in the first place: Genghis. Khan genuinely tried peaceful trade first with a huge and wealthy empire to the west called the Khwarazmian Empire, which stretched across Persia and Central Asia. He sent a large caravan of 500 merchants westward specifically to open formal trade relations. The governor of a border city accused these merchants of spying on flimsy pretext, seized every bit of their goods for himself, and had every single one of them executed when Genghis Khan responded by sending official diplomats to demand an explanation and justice. The ruler of Khwarazm had the lead envoy killed outright and sent the other diplomats home with their heads shaved in deliberate humiliation. That single insult was the spark. Genghis Khan personally led more than 100,000 seasoned troops across brutal, icy mountain terrain in order to erase the entire Khwarazmian Empire from the map. Magnificent cities that had stood for centuries as glittering centers of learning, art, and international trade were leveled almost completely. Ancient irrigation, systems that had taken over 1,000 years to build and perfect, were deliberately destroyed, turning once fertile farmland into barren desert that in some places never fully recovered. The corrupt governor who had started the whole conflict was reportedly executed by having molten silver poured directly into his eyes and ears. A punishment, seemingly designed to match his original greed with brutal precision. Some accounts from the period, likely exaggerated for dramatic effect, but still reflecting very real horror, claim that certain regions of Persia did not recover their pre-invasion population levels for several centuries afterward. This campaign also revealed something entirely new about Mongol strategy. Terror itself had become a deliberate weapon. Survivors were often allowed to flee westward, carrying horrifying first-hand stories of destruction ahead of the army as it advanced, so that by the time Mongol soldiers actually showed up outside the next city's walls, the defenders inside were frequently already half-beaten psychologically. Purely out of pure dread of what was coming, what made the Mongols so terrifyingly effective, though, wasn't just brutality and fear. It was their equipment, their training and their tactics working together as one system. Their composite recurve bow could pierce armor from a distance most rival archers couldn't even hope to match. Each rider carried several spare horses and swapped mounts continuously, while riding at a full gallop, letting entire armies cover enormous distances in a single day, far faster than any rival force anywhere else in the world at that time. When supplies ran critically low during long marches, warriors would cut a small vein in their horse's neck and drink a little blood directly from it, sometimes mixed with fermented mare's milk, all without ever needing to stop, dismount, or set up camp. Their signature battlefield trick was the feigned retreat. Pretend to panic and flee, lure overconfident enemy cavalry out of its defensive formation in pursuit, then suddenly wheel back around and surround the scattered enemy completely from every direction at once. If a city surrendered, peacefully without resistance, it was usually spared and simply absorbed into the empire. If it chose to resist, every person and animal inside was killed as a deliberate warning sent down the road to the very next city, which is exactly why so many cities simply gave up the moment word arrived that the Mongols were on their way, long before a single horseman ever appeared at their gates. Mongol intelligence gathering matched their battlefield tactics in sophistication. Scouts and merchant spies would quietly map out enemy roads, water sources, and city defenses in extraordinary detail, sometimes over the course of years rather than mere months, long before any actual invasion began. Genghis Khan reportedly studied these reports with the same intensity a modern commander might study satellite imagery. refusing to commit his forces until he genuinely understood an opponent's weaknesses inside and out. In his final years, now well into his 60s, Genghis Khan suffered a serious fall from his horse during a campaign against a kingdom that had betrayed an old alliance by refusing to send promised reinforcements. He refused to stop leading the campaign despite the severe internal injuries that followed. And in August of 1227, somewhere in the mountains of what is now China, he finally died. He gave one last order before his death: keep the news secret until his current enemy had been completely destroyed, so they could take no comfort or courage from word of his passing, to protect the exact location of his grave. Forever, his personal guards reportedly killed everyone they encountered along the entire funeral procession route, then used 1,000 horses to trample the burial site completely flat, and even diverted the course of a nearby river to flow directly over the grave itself. To this very day, even with modern satellites and ground-penetrating radar, nobody has ever managed to find his tomb. Before he died, he divided his vast territory between his 4 sons, hoping to avoid the kind of catastrophic succession war that had destroyed so many empires before his own, a plan that mostly delayed the inevitable rather than truly preventing it. His chosen successor was his 3rd son, Ogedei, not necessarily the fiercest fighter among his brothers, but the one most widely regarded as capable of holding rival factions together through diplomacy rather than force. Ogedei built the empire's very first permanent capital city, transforming a purely nomadic empire into something with real administrative structure for the first time, and he then sent his single greatest general, a man named Subutai, deep into the territories of Russia and onward into the heart of Europe. Itself, what followed terrified 2 entire continents almost simultaneously. The Mongols used frozen, ice-covered rivers as natural highways for their fast-moving cavalry, striking cities that had never imagined an enemy could move that quickly across terrain that would normally be impassable swampland during any other season. The great city of Kiev was burned entirely to the ground in the year 1240, following a brutal and prolonged siege. Polish and Hungarian armies were crushed within just 2 days of each other in 1241. In decisive battles, fought hundreds of kilometers apart, yet somehow coordinated with a level of timing precision that stunned European observers who had no comparable communication technology of their own. European chroniclers were so confused and terrified by these sudden invaders that they mixed their name up with a mythical hell-related word, which is actually where the term still used to describe them today originally comes from. By the end of 1241, Mongol cavalry units had already reached the immediate outskirts of Vienna. All of Western Europe stood frozen in genuine, paralyzing fear, with seemingly no remaining military force anywhere on the continent capable of meaningfully stopping the advance. And then, almost unbelievably, a single messenger arrived from the distant east, carrying news that Great Khan Ogedei had suddenly died back in Mongolia, reportedly as a direct result of years of heavy drinking that had steadily ruined his health. Under strict Mongol law, every commander and every royal relative throughout the entire empire was legally required to immediately abandon whatever campaign they were fighting and return home at once to help select a new Great Khan. So the army sitting at the very gates of Vienna simply turned around and rode home, and Western Europe was saved, essentially by an accident of timing playing out in a distant capital thousands of kilometers away. Historians still debate today whether the Mongols could have realistically conquered the whole of Western Europe if that death hadn't happened. At exactly that moment, what remains undeniable is the sheer psychological devastation left behind across the continent, with entire regions of Hungary and Poland left depopulated for years afterward, fields sitting completely unplanted simply because there weren't enough surviving farmers left to work them. After Ogedei's death, the empire spent roughly 5 long years locked in bitter political infighting between rival branches of the royal family before a new leader named Mongke finally secured the throne in 1251. He carried out a sweeping purge of political rivals to firmly secure his own position, then launched 2 massive military campaigns at the exact same time, sending one brother west toward the heart. of the Middle East, while another brother pushed east to finally finish off the long-delayed conquest of southern China. The Western campaign, personally led by his brother Hulagu, was aimed squarely at Baghdad, at that time one of the single greatest centers of science, medicine, and scholarship found anywhere on the entire planet. The ruler of Baghdad refused to surrender the city, placing his complete trust in the strength of its massive walls and in his sincere belief that divine protection alone would save him. Those walls did not hold. Somewhere between 80,000 and 200,000 residents were killed over the course of just a few horrific days. An enormous library, holding centuries' worth of accumulated scientific and philosophical knowledge, was burned completely to the ground, and so many books and manuscripts were thrown into the river that witnesses at the time claimed the water ran visibly black with ink for days afterward, to avoid spilling royal blood directly onto the ground. Something Mongol tradition treated as a serious taboo, the captured ruler was instead rolled tightly inside a heavy carpet and trampled to death by horses. Hulagu's own wife, a devout Christian, is credited with convincing him to spare much of the city's substantial Christian population. A small but telling reminder that this royal family genuinely held a mix of different faiths, and that those personal beliefs sometimes actually shaped major political decisions made at the very highest levels of power. Hulagu then wanted to push further, this time into Egypt itself. But news suddenly arrived that Great Khan Mongke had died as well, far away during a separate campaign in China. And just as had happened once before at the gates of Vienna, most of his army had to turn around immediately and head home for the succession process, leaving behind only a relatively small garrison force to hold the entire Middle Eastern frontier alone. The disciplined Mamluk army of Egypt, made up largely of former slave soldiers who had personally trained in steppe-style mounted warfare themselves, immediately recognized this sudden withdrawal as a golden strategic opportunity. In the year 1260, at a decisive battle called Ain Jalut, fought in what is now present-day Israel, the Mamluk commanders turned the Mongols' own signature feigned retreat trick directly back against them, successfully luring an overconfident Mongol force into a carefully prepared trap and annihilating it almost completely. It was the first time in recorded history that a Mongol army had suffered a decisive defeat. It simply could not later reverse or avenge, and it permanently halted any further Mongol expansion southward toward the African continent. Proof, finally, that this army everyone across 3 continents had assumed was completely unbeatable could actually be beaten, if you studied it closely enough and learned to fight it on its own terms. Meanwhile, back in the east, Great Khan Mongke's brother Kublai took over leadership of the eastern half of the fracturing empire and focused his complete attention on finally finishing the long-delayed conquest of southern China. This particular campaign proved exceptionally difficult and frustrating. The terrain throughout southern China was thick with rivers, flooded rice paddies, and dense forest. Terrain where the Mongols' usual cavalry advantage was almost completely neutralized, so Kublai adapted his entire strategy once again, building a substantial new Mongol navy from scratch and bringing in skilled Arab engineers to design massive siege trebuchets specifically built to smash through the formidable fortified cities of southern China one by one. In the year 1279, the long-resistant Song dynasty finally collapsed completely, and Kublai Khan became the very first foreign-born ruler in all of Chinese history to successfully control the entirety of China under one unified government. He founded an entirely new ruling dynasty, moved the imperial capital permanently to the city now known as Beijing, and deliberately presented himself as a traditional Chinese emperor, a calculated political move designed specifically to win the lasting loyalty of his many new Chinese subjects, all while keeping a separate summer palace far to the north, where he could still hunt on horseback and live by traditional steppe customs whenever formal court life grew too restrictive for his taste. He restored and expanded the Grand Canal, reformed the postal relay system his grandfather had first established, and promoted the widespread use of paper currency throughout his territories, a financial innovation that left visiting European travelers absolutely astonished. Since nothing comparable existed anywhere back in their own homelands, But a great many ethnic Chinese scholars and former officials from the previous dynasty never accepted the new rulers as legitimate, no matter how thoroughly Kublai adopted Chinese customs and ceremonies, and his own laws formally placed Mongols above native Chinese subjects in matters of taxation, law and access to government positions, a deep resentment that simmered quietly beneath the surface for generations to come. His court, though, became a genuine magnet for talent and ideas from across the entire known world. Persian astronomers, Tibetan Buddhist monks, Nestorian Christian priests, and European travelers like Marco Polo all passed through the very same sprawling capital, sometimes a dozen different languages spoken within a single audience hall on any given afternoon. Never fully satisfied with the enormous power he had already accumulated, Kublai turned his ambitions toward the island nation of Japan. He sent formal envoys demanding immediate surrender, but the proud Japanese samurai responded by beheading the unfortunate messengers and sending nothing back in reply. His first invasion fleet, launched in 1274, was struck by an unexpectedly violent overnight storm, sinking many of the ships and forcing a hasty, humiliating withdrawal back across the sea, refusing to accept that initial defeat. Kublai assembled the single largest naval invasion force the world had ever seen up to that point in the year 1281, an enormous fleet of roughly 4,000 ships carrying approximately 140,000 soldiers, just as fierce. Fighting was raging along the Japanese coastline. An unusually powerful typhoon struck the fleet without warning, destroying more than 80% of the entire invasion force and sending it permanently to the bottom of the sea. The Japanese firmly believed this devastating storm represented direct divine intervention on their behalf, and they named it the Divine Wind, a name that would resurface centuries later in a very different and far more tragic context during the Second World War. This catastrophic failure permanently shattered the long-standing myth that Mongol military power simply could not be defeated under any circumstances. Japan remained the one major regional power that the Mongol Empire, even at the absolute peak of its global military strength, simply proved unable to conquer, despite everything, despite the fire, the bodies, and the flattened cities left behind across 3 continents. The empire eventually settled into something genuinely unexpected, a long stretch of relative peace and stability known as the Pax Mongolica, which allowed global trade to flourish on a scale the world had never previously seen. The Mongols came to control the entire length of the legendary Silk Road and stationed organized guards along its many routes, finally allowing merchants to travel safely all the way from Europe to East Asia without serious fear of bandit attacks for the first time in many centuries. They also built an extraordinarily efficient messaging network featuring relay stations placed roughly every 40 kilometers along major routes, allowing urgent messages to travel up to 300 kilometers in a single day. An astonishing speed for the era. The famous Venetian merchant Marco Polo personally traveled along this very network and reportedly served within Kublai Khan's own royal court for as long as 17 years, later bringing back fantastic tales of the empire's wealth to a largely disbelieving Europe. Cultural and technological exchange exploded rapidly across the entire empire during this period. Gunpowder and paper currency traveled steadily westward out of China, while advanced mathematics and astronomy from the Arab world flowed back eastward into China in return, fundamentally reshaping both civilizations at once. The Mongols also practiced a remarkable degree of religious tolerance for their era, something almost unheard of anywhere else in the medieval world. Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, and Taoist clergy were all formally exempted from taxation and openly permitted to debate freely within the royal court itself. This era of relative stability also genuinely transformed European understanding of the wider world. Maps produced in cities like Venice suddenly began including accurate details of Central Asia and China for the very first time, information gathered directly from merchants and missionaries who could now travel the entire length of the Silk Road in relative safety thanks to Mongol protection. But the very same vast trade networks that had once brought the empire such extraordinary wealth eventually became the empire's undoing as well. The devastating Black Death plague traveled steadily along established Mongol merchant routes, carried Unknowingly, by trading ships moving from Asia all the way into Europe, the plague ultimately killed many millions of people across both China and Europe. And the once thriving economic engine of the Silk Road collapsed almost entirely as international trade ground to a halt, and once bustling cities emptied out in horrifying numbers. In the 1350s, China itself was struck by devastating droughts and severe flooding along the Yellow River, compounded further by rampant corruption among local Mongol officials. These overlapping crises together finally ignited a massive uprising known as the Red Turban Rebellion among an increasingly desperate Chinese population. In the year 1368, a former peasant named Zhu Yuanzhang, a man who had once been orphaned by famine and plague and spent years as a wandering, begging monk, successfully led a rebel army that thoroughly crushed the remaining Mongol forces, driving them entirely out of the imperial capital and founding the new Ming dynasty firmly in their place. In a strange and almost poetic twist of history, his rise from beggar to emperor mirrors the very same path Temujin had once walked over, a century and a half earlier, on the opposite end of the social ladder entirely. The retreat from China wasn't a sudden total collapse, though remnants of the old ruling court fled north and continued to rule a much smaller steppe kingdom for several more decades, still claiming the title of legitimate emperor, even from their diminished encampments far from the lost splendor of Beijing. Across the rest of the fractured empire, similar declines unfolded at different speeds and for different reasons. The territories in Russia gradually lost their grip over local princes throughout the 15th century, as rising powers like Moscow grew steadily stronger and increasingly unwilling to pay tribute to an overlord whose internal divisions had grown impossible to hide. The branch ruling Persia had already collapsed decades earlier amid succession disputes and economic mismanagement. Only the branch controlling Central Asia endured in any recognizable form, eventually feeding into the foundation of a new Conquerors' empire that would itself claim direct descent from the original Mongol line. The largest land empire in all of human history had finally dissolved completely, leaving behind nothing but the long shadow of its terror and the undeniable scale of everything it had once achieved. Yet the legacy did not simply vanish along with the empire itself. Descendants of Genghis Khan continued ruling smaller successor states for generations afterward, including a kingdom that would persist for centuries longer, and an empire founded in India by a man who proudly traced his lineage directly back to the original conqueror himself. Modern genetic studies have even suggested that a remarkable percentage of men across Asia today carry a Y chromosome lineage, strongly associated with Genghis Khan's direct bloodline, a staggering testament to the sheer scale of his family's historical reach across the centuries. Beyond bloodlines, the practical legacy of the empire reshaped the modern world in ways still felt today. Trade networks, diplomatic customs, and administrative practices pioneered under Mongol rule influenced the kingdoms and empires that followed for centuries afterward, from Ming China to the rising principalities that would eventually grow into the Russian Empire. So in the end, this isn't really just a story about brutality, even though brutality was undeniably a part of it. It's the story of one abandoned, starving boy who refused to accept the ending the steppe had written for him. A boy who turned loyalty earned through respect into the foundation of the largest connected empire the world had ever known, and who, for one brief and terrifying stretch of human history, made the entire known world answer to a single name.